The executive elevator at Meridian Technologies headquarters in Boston opened onto the 42nd floor at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday in October, releasing Richard Ashford into a corridor lit only by emergency lighting and the ambient glow from the city filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. He was 63 years old, worth approximately $4.2 billion, according to the most recent Forbes estimate, and he had built Meridian from a small software consultancy into a multinational technology conglomerate over the course of 35 years. The 42nd floor housed the executive offices, and Richard was returning to retrieve a document he had left in his office earlier that evening, some merger paperwork that his attorneys needed reviewed before a morning meeting. The cleaning crew worked the executive floors after 11 p.m., the janitorial staff operating in the hours when the building's actual business had concluded and the spaces could be returned to their performative state of executive tidiness. Richard saw the janitor immediately, a black man who appeared to be in his late 50s, pushing a cart loaded with cleaning supplies and trash bags, working his way methodically through the corridor. The man wore the standard uniform of the facilities services contractor, navy blue work clothes with a name badge that Richard did not bother to read, and he was listening to something through earbuds, his expression absorbed in whatever audio occupied his attention. Richard walked past without acknowledgement, the habit of powerful men who had long ago stopped seeing the labor that sustained their environments, and he unlocked his office door with the key card that automatically tracked executive access for security purposes. The office was large and appointed with the careful restraint that signaled wealth without ostentation. A desk made from reclaimed wood that had cost more than most people earned in 6 months. Chairs upholstered in Italian leather, art on the walls from emerging artists whose careers Richard's wife collected as casually as other people collected pottery. The document was not on his desk where he thought he had left it, and Richard spent several minutes searching through the organized chaos of his workspace, growing increasingly irritated. He was a man accustomed to efficiency, to systems that worked, to subordinates who anticipated his needs and ensured that his time was never wasted on tasks that others could handle. The fact that he was in his office at nearly midnight searching for paperwork felt like a personal affront, a symptom of inadequate support staff. He heard the vacuum cleaner start in the corridor, the industrial machine's motor cutting through the quiet, and something about the sound annoyed him further, a reminder that his building was being cleaned by people who likely had not graduated high school, while he had been educated at Harvard and had built a technology empire. Richard walked back into the corridor, intending to ask the janitor to delay vacuuming until he had located his document and left, but what he saw stopped him mid-stride. The janitor had removed his earbuds and was standing near the window holding a book, reading by the ambient light from the city. The book was clearly visible, and Richard recognized it immediately because he had written it, The Architecture of Digital Transformation, his 2019 book based on his Harvard Business School thesis from 1985, updated and expanded for a contemporary audience. The book had sold modestly, was used in some business school curricula, and represented Richard's attempt to establish himself as a thought leader beyond just a successful entrepreneur. "Interesting choice of reading material," Richard said, his tone carrying the particular condescension that wealthy people employed when encountering unexpected behavior from service workers. "You a fan of business theory?" The janitor looked up, meeting Richard's gaze directly, and his expression was carefully neutral. "Just trying to understand how systems change. Your thesis has some interesting arguments about technological adoption patterns." "My thesis," Richard repeated, emphasizing the possessive. "You realize that book is based on Harvard doctoral work? Pretty advanced material for—" He gestured vaguely at the janitor's uniform, the cleaning cart, the vacuum cleaner sitting idle in the hallway. "For someone like me," the janitor finished the sentence, and there was no hostility in his voice, just a weary recognition of what Richard was implying. "I'm just saying it's not exactly light reading." Most people without advanced education would find it pretty impenetrable. Richard felt generous, making even this mild acknowledgement, as if he were doing the janitor a favor by engaging in conversation at all. The janitor set the book down on his cart carefully, as if he were placing something precious in a safe location. The section on network effects and institutional resistance is particularly compelling. Page 147, where you argue that organizational transformation fails not because of technological limitations, but because power structures resist changes that threaten their authority. You write that hierarchies persist not through efficiency, but through the systematic devaluation of knowledge that originates outside credentialed channels. Richard stared at him, the exact quotation hanging in the air between them. It was not a famous passage, not something that had been excerpted in reviews or discussion. It was from the middle of the book, part of a theoretical section that most readers probably skipped. And the janitor had quoted it precisely, had identified the page number, had contextualized it within the broader argument. "You've read the book," Richard said, stating the obvious, because he needed a moment to process what had just happened. "I've read the book, and the thesis it's based on. The original 1985 version, before you expanded it. The Harvard Business School Archives has it digitized. Different theoretical framework in some sections, particularly around stakeholder theory. You were more radical in the thesis than in the book. This could not be happening. Richard Ashford did not have conversations at midnight with janitors about his doctoral thesis, did not encounter custodial staff who had accessed Harvard's digital archives, did not find himself in situations where the person who cleaned his office appeared to have a deeper familiarity with his academic work than most of his executive team. "Who are you?" Richard asked, and the question emerged less as curiosity and more as a demand, an assertion of his right to classify and understand the people who occupied his space. "My name is James Carter. I clean your office 3 nights a week. We've met probably 50 times over the past 2 years, but you've never looked at me long enough to remember." James said this without apparent bitterness, just as a statement of fact, a description of how the world worked when you were a black janitor in a building full of white executives. If you are following this account and recognizing something familiar in the dynamics between Richard and James, something that echoes encounters you have witnessed or experienced where assumptions about intelligence and education are mapped onto job titles and skin color, consider the value of ensuring stories like this reach wider audiences. The act of sharing these chronicles creates accountability, makes visible the patterns that too many people prefer to ignore. Richard felt something shift in his chest, a complicated mixture of defensiveness and curiosity, and the uncomfortable awareness that he had been revealed as someone who made exactly the kinds of assumptions he had criticized in his own writing. "You've obviously had education beyond what most people in your position have. Most people in my position are plenty educated. We just clean buildings for a living." James picked up his book and placed it inside his work bag, a gesture that suggested the conversation was ending on his terms rather than Richard's. "I should get back to work. You're looking for the merger documents with Castellan Systems. They're in your credenza, bottom drawer, under the quarterly reports. Your assistant filed them there yesterday afternoon." He knew about the merger. He knew where Richard's assistant filed documents. He moved through this building with a level of attention and awareness that Richard had never considered, had never imagined, had structured his entire understanding of workplace hierarchy to avoid acknowledging. "Wait," Richard said, and James paused, his hand on the vacuum cleaner handle. "How do you know about the Castellan merger? That's not public information. I clean the conference rooms where your team meets. I empty the trash cans that contain the preliminary discussion notes people throw away instead of shredding. I work in a building where executives have conversations in hallways and elevators, as if the custodial staff are furniture, invisible and irrelevant. You learn a lot about a company when people don't know you're listening." The implication was clear, and Richard felt a spike of alarm. Confidential information, competitive intelligence, strategic planning, all of it discussed in the presence of custodial staff who were assumed to be either unable to understand or uninterested in understanding the business being conducted around them. Are you saying you've been gathering competitive intelligence while cleaning? Richard's voice had taken on an edge, the automatic defensiveness of someone who had built a company on information control and who was suddenly confronting the possibility that his security was less robust than he had assumed. I'm saying that I have ears and a brain, and that you and everyone else in this building have consistently operated as if I have neither. James met his gaze steadily. I have not leaked information, have not sold secrets, have not done anything except exist in this space and occasionally read books while I'm on break. But your question reveals something interesting, which is that your concern is not that you misjudged my intelligence or education. Your concern is that your misjudgment might have created business risk. It was an accurate assessment, and Richard did not like being assessed accurately by someone he had spent 2 years not seeing. I think we should continue this conversation in my office. I think I should finish my work and go home. It's nearly midnight, and I have another job that starts at 6 a.m. Another job. Of course he had another job. People who cleaned office buildings at night worked multiple jobs because custodial work paid wages that could not support a single adult, much less a family. Richard had signed the facilities services contract that governed James Carter's employment, had approved the budget that determined how much Meridian would pay the contractor, had made decisions that directly shaped the economic reality of people whose existence he had never seriously considered. I'll pay you for your time. Consulting rate, whatever that would be. 1 hour. I want to understand who you are and what you know. Richard was negotiating now, applying the skills that had made him wealthy to a situation that was not really a negotiation because the power differential was too extreme. James studied him for a long moment, and Richard could not read his expression, could not determine whether the janitor was calculating the value of the offer or simply deciding whether engaging further was worth the effort. $500 for 1 hour, cash, and you actually listen instead of just waiting to talk. $500 was nothing to Richard Ashford, was less than he spent on a business lunch, was a rounding error in his personal finances. To James Carter, it was probably a week's wages from the custodial job. The disparity was obscene, and Richard had never questioned it before, because questioning it would have required acknowledging the systems that produced such disparities, systems from which he benefited enormously. Done. My office. They sat on opposite sides of Richard's desk, a spatial arrangement that reinforced hierarchy even as the conversation that followed undermined it. Richard had retrieved 5 $100 bills from the wall safe where he kept emergency cash, and he placed them on the desk between them, a tangible acknowledgement of the transaction they were conducting. "Tell me about your education," Richard said, and it emerged as a command rather than a request, the habitual assertion of authority that powerful men deployed without thinking. James picked up the cash and folded it carefully into his wallet before responding. "I have a master's degree in organizational psychology from Columbia. I completed coursework for a PhD but did not finish the dissertation. I've published 3 peer-reviewed articles on workplace dynamics and power structures in professional environments. I speak 4 languages fluently. I read constantly, everything from business theory to philosophy to physics. Does that answer your question?" Richard felt disoriented, the way people feel when their understanding of reality is revealed to be substantially incomplete. "If you have that background, why are you cleaning offices?" "Because I am 58 years old, Black, and I have a 15-year gap in my employment history during which I was incarcerated. Turns out that combination makes you essentially unemployable in professional settings, regardless of your education or competence. Custodial work is one of the few industries that will hire people with felony convictions, and that pays enough to survive, even if barely. incarcerated felon. The words carried weight in American discourse, carried assumptions and judgments and social stigma that Richard had never personally confronted because he had never been in a position where those labels might apply to him. He had broken laws, small ones, tax optimization strategies that lived in gray areas, regulatory violations that his attorneys handled discreetly. But he had never faced prosecution, had never been arrested, had been insulated by wealth and whiteness and connections from the carceral system that consumed disproportionate numbers of black men. "What were you convicted of?" Richard asked, and immediately knew the question was wrong, too personal, too presumptuous. "Does it matter? You've already made every judgment you're going to make based on the fact that I have a record. The specific charge is just details. What matters is that you are sitting here shocked that a janitor can quote your thesis, shocked that someone in my position has graduate education, shocked that I might be intellectually capable. And your shock reveals your assumptions about who has intelligence, who has education, who deserves to be taken seriously." Richard wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself against the implicit accusation, but James was right. The shock Richard felt was not shock that an educated person existed, but shock that an educated person was working as a janitor, and that shock depended entirely on assumptions he had made about the relationship between intelligence, education, employment, and worth. "The thesis you quoted," Richard said, shifting the conversation towards safer intellectual ground. "You said I was more radical in the original than in the book." "How so?" James leaned back in the chair, and his posture shifted slightly, becoming more relaxed, as if discussing ideas allowed him to temporarily inhabit a different version of himself. "The thesis had a whole section on how organizations use credentialism to maintain class and racial hierarchies. You argued that requiring degrees for positions that don't actually need them is a way to exclude qualified people who lack access to higher education, and that this exclusion is neither accidental nor neutral. It's a tool for preserving elite power. But when you turned the thesis into a book, you softened that section significantly. You removed the explicit discussion of race. You reframed the argument as being about efficiency rather than about justice. You made it palatable for the business school audience who would buy the book, but who did not want to be challenged about their own complicity in structural inequality. Richard had made those changes deliberately, on the advice of his editor and his publisher, who had told him that business books needed to be practical and applicable, not polemical and political. He had convinced himself that the changes were strategic, that reaching a wider audience justified the theoretical dilution. But hearing James describe it, hearing his own intellectual compromise articulated by a janitor who had read both versions carefully enough to identify the differences, made the rationalizations feel hollow. "The book sold better than the thesis would have," Richard said defensively, "and in doing so, it reinforced the very systems you originally critiqued. You became successful by softening your analysis of the conditions that enabled your success. That's how the game works. That's why structural change is so difficult. The people with the platforms to critique power are the same people who benefit from not critiquing it too forcefully." It was a devastatingly accurate assessment, and Richard felt something he rarely experienced, the intellectual discomfort of being outmaneuvered in a conversation, of encountering someone whose analysis was sharper and whose willingness to speak uncomfortable truths was greater than his own. Most of the people Richard interacted with were either subordinates who wanted something from him or peers who shared his class position and its attendant interests. James Carter wanted nothing from him except the $500 already collected, and his class position gave him no incentive to flatter or accommodate. "You said you were incarcerated for 15 years, Richard said, trying to understand the timeline. "When were you released?" 7 years ago. "I've been working custodial jobs since then. This is actually one of the better positions: consistent schedule, decent pay relative to the industry, benefits through the contractor. I'm not complaining about the work itself. I'm just observing that my education and my intelligence are assumed not to exist because of what I do for a living and because of how I look. Have you tried to return to your field, to use your degree? James laughed, a sound without humor. I've applied to hundreds of positions: organizational development, human resources, consulting, research, teaching. Every application asks about criminal history. Every background check reveals my conviction. Every interview ends the same way, with polite expressions of interest and then silence. Employers don't want to take a chance on someone with a record, particularly not a black man with a record, particularly not for positions that involve authority or credibility. So I clean offices. And I read. And I watch people like you move through the world convinced of your own meritocracy, while being oblivious to how much of your success depends on systems that exclude people like me. Richard wanted to argue that his success was earned, that he had worked hard, that Meridian Technologies was built through innovation and strategic vision. But he also knew that his ability to work hard had been enabled by circumstances, by parents who paid for Harvard, by a social network that provided early investments, by a society that treated white male entrepreneurs as visionaries, while treating black men with the same ideas as risks. What would you do if you could do anything? Richard asked. If the constraints you're describing didn't exist? James considered the question seriously. I would do exactly what I tried to do before I was incarcerated, which is study how organizations systematically exclude talented people and how those exclusions create inefficiencies and injustices. I would research why companies like Meridian claim to value diversity, but somehow always end up with executive teams that are overwhelmingly white and male. I would investigate how much potential is wasted because people make the same assumptions about intelligence and capability that you made about me tonight. And I would try to create interventions that actually changed organizational culture rather than just performing change for public relations purposes. It was a more coherent vision than most of Richard's executive team could articulate about their own work. And it was a vision being pursued by a man who cleaned toilets because the world had decided that a conviction from 2 decades ago was more relevant than his intelligence or his education or his potential contribution. The hour Richard had purchased was nearly over, and he felt an unexpected reluctance to let the conversation end. I want to hire you, not as a consultant but as an actual employee. Someone on my team working on organizational development or culture change or whatever we want to call it. Your skills are being wasted pushing a vacuum cleaner. James's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a combination of skepticism and wariness. You want to hire me because you feel guilty about your assumptions, and hiring me would allow you to feel like you're doing something good without actually examining the systems that created this situation in the first place. I want to hire you because you're clearly brilliant, and I'm watching talent be wasted because of structural barriers that are unjust. Richard was aware, even as he spoke, that James was right, that the offer was motivated at least partially by guilt, but he also believed that the underlying premise was sound. What happens when your executive team asks about my background? When someone runs a background check and discovers my conviction? When clients or board members question why you've hired a former felon for a position of authority? Are you prepared to defend that decision when it becomes expensive or inconvenient? James stood up, preparing to leave, and his posture was not hostile, but final. You're offering something that sounds generous in this moment at midnight, when it's just the two of us. But in the daylight, with your board and your executives and your shareholders weighing in, that generosity will evaporate. And I'll be left having quit a stable job for an opportunity that disappeared as soon as it became complicated. Richard wanted to protest that he was serious, that he would follow through, but James's skepticism was earned through experience, through a lifetime of encountering white people who made promises in moments of guilt or inspiration, and then failed to keep them when keeping them required sustained effort or social cost. At least give me your contact information. Let me think about how to structure this seriously, how to do it in a way that's sustainable. Richard pulled out his phone, waiting for James to provide details. James recited a phone number and an email address, and Richard entered them into his contacts, the first time he had ever collected personal information from someone who cleaned his building. "I'm not holding my breath," James said, "but if you're serious, and if you can actually create a position that uses my skills rather than just putting me in a diversity role for optics, then call me. Otherwise, I'll see you next Wednesday when I clean your office, and we can both pretend this conversation never happened." He left, pushing his vacuum cleaner cart down the corridor, returning to the work that paid his immediate bills, while Richard stood in his office doorway watching and thinking about the distance between meritocracy as ideology and meritocracy as practiced reality. Richard Ashford did not sleep well that night, his mind churning through the conversation with James Carter, through the implications of what had been said and what had been revealed. He arrived at his office at 7:30 the next morning, earlier than usual, and by 8 he was in a meeting with his Chief Human Resources Officer, a white woman named Elizabeth Corwin, who had been with Meridian for 12 years and who managed all personnel decisions for the company's 3,000 employees. "I want to talk about our hiring practices," Richard said without preamble, "specifically around candidates with criminal records." Elizabeth pulled up information on her laptop, quickly accessing policy documents. "We conduct background checks on all candidates who reach the final interview stage. Any felony conviction requires VP-level approval for hire, and certain categories of convictions are automatic disqualifiers depending on the role. It's standard practice, necessary for insurance purposes and client confidence." "How many candidates have we rejected because of criminal records?" "I don't have that data immediately available, but I can pull it." "Why are you asking?" Richard described the encounter with James Carter, leaving out some of the more personal details, but conveying the essential fact that they had a custodial worker with a master's degree and substantial intellectual capabilities working in their building, because his felony record made professional employment impossible. Elizabeth listened, her expression carefully neutral, and when Richard finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding. "I understand why you're concerned, but hiring someone with a felony conviction into a professional role creates significant risks. Legal liability if something goes wrong, reputational risks if clients or partners find out, internal culture issues if other employees object, and honestly, board-level pushback. They've been very clear that they want us to be careful about who represents the company. Even if the person is extraordinarily qualified, even if the conviction is old and the person has clearly rebuilt their life, the qualification question becomes subjective, and the age of the conviction doesn't eliminate the liability concerns. I'm not saying it's fair. I'm saying it's the reality of how these decisions get made in corporate environments." Richard felt frustration rising, the sense that he was encountering institutional resistance of exactly the type he had described in his thesis, the pattern where power structures used ostensibly neutral policies to maintain exclusion. What if I made it a priority? What if I said I wanted us to seriously reconsider our approach to candidates with criminal records? Elizabeth closed her laptop, signaling that the conversation had moved beyond data and into politics. "Then you would need to convince the board, the legal team, the insurance carriers, and the executive team that the benefits outweigh the risks. And you would need to be prepared for the first time something goes wrong with an employee who has a record, because that incident will be used to justify never taking that risk again. Is this really the hill you want to die on? It was a reasonable question, and Richard did not have an immediate answer. He had built Meridian by picking his battles carefully, by understanding when to push and when to accommodate, by maintaining relationships with powerful people who could either support or obstruct his objectives. Spending political capital on changing hiring practices for people with criminal records was not something he had ever imagined prioritizing, had never appeared on his strategic agenda, had existed outside the frame of problems he considered solvable or worth solving. But James Carter's face kept appearing in his mind. The expression of weary recognition when Richard had called him uneducated, the precision with which he had quoted the thesis, the casual intelligence with which he had analyzed Richard's own intellectual compromises. The waste was infuriating, the loss to society and to Meridian of someone who could contribute enormously, but who was excluded by systems that Richard had never questioned. "Set up a small working group," Richard said. HR, legal, maybe someone from organizational development. I want us to examine our hiring practices around criminal records, compare them to best practices, and identify whether there are changes we can make that would allow us to access talent we're currently excluding without creating unacceptable risk. Is this about James Carter specifically, or about policy generally? Both. I want to hire him, if we can structure it appropriately. But I also want to understand whether we're systematically excluding qualified people because of background check policies that are overly broad. Elizabeth nodded, making notes. I'll set it up. But I want to be clear that this is going to be complicated, and it's going to take time. Criminal justice reform is politically charged, and any changes we make will be scrutinized internally and externally. You need to be prepared for that. I'm prepared. Just get it started. And the working group met for the first time a week later, and the conversation immediately revealed the complexity of what Richard was proposing. The legal team outlined liability concerns, the ways that negligent hiring claims could be brought if an employee with a criminal record engaged in misconduct. The insurance representative explained that their coverage required certain screening practices and that modifying those practices might increase premiums. The HR team described the practical challenges of assessing which convictions were relevant to which roles and which could be safely overlooked. And everyone in the room, with the exception of Richard, seemed to share an unspoken assumption that changing hiring practices to be more inclusive of people with criminal records was a nice idea in theory but unworkable in practice, a form of social justice that was fundamentally incompatible with business reality. Richard listened to the objections, recognizing the pattern he had described in his thesis, the way organizations used process and policy and risk assessment to avoid change. But he also recognized that he was asking people to take real risks, that negligent hiring claims were not hypothetical, that board members and clients would raise legitimate questions. The challenge was determining how much risk was acceptable in pursuit of justice, how to balance the moral imperative of giving people second chances against the practical imperative of protecting the organization. "Let's start smaller," Richard said, interrupting the circular conversation about liabilities. "I want to pilot a program where we hire 5 people with criminal records over the next year, carefully selected, thoroughly vetted, placed in roles where we can provide support and supervision. We document outcomes, track performance, assess whether the risks materialize or whether they're overstated, and we use that data to inform a broader policy revision." And it was a compromise, a way of moving forward without committing to wholesale change, and the people in the room received it with cautious agreement. Pilots were safe, could be framed as innovative without being threatening, could be discontinued if they failed without creating major disruption. And James Carter is one of the 5, Richard added. I want to offer him a position as a senior organizational development consultant, reporting directly to Elizabeth. Salary commensurate with his education and experience, not with his current custodial role. Elizabeth looked uncomfortable. What's his conviction for? We need to know that before we can assess fit. Richard realized he did not know, had not asked beyond James's brief mention, had been operating on the assumption that it did not matter. But of course it mattered, at least for this process, at least for the assessment of risk that everyone was demanding. I'll find out. But I want us to proceed with the assumption that unless there's a clear connection between his conviction and the work he'd be doing, we're moving forward with the hire. He called James Carter that afternoon, using the number from their midnight conversation, and was surprised when James answered on the second ring with a wary hello that suggested he received few calls and expected most of them to be problems. James, it's Richard Ashford, from Meridian. We talked last week. A pause. I remember. You offered me a job that I assumed would evaporate by morning. It hasn't evaporated. I'm serious about hiring you, but I need some information to move the process forward. My HR team needs to know about your conviction, not because I'm judging, but because we have policies and insurance requirements and liability concerns. What were you convicted of? The silence stretched long enough that Richard thought the call might have dropped, but then James spoke, his voice flat and controlled. Armed robbery. I was 23. I made terrible decisions during a period of my life when I was desperate and stupid. I served 15 years in federal prison. I've been out for 7 years without any legal issues, working, rebuilding my life. Does that answer your question? Armed robbery. Richard felt his certainty waver, felt the abstract commitment to second chances colliding with the concrete reality of a violent felony conviction. His executive team would object. His board would object. His insurance company would object. Every instinct shaped by decades of corporate risk management told him to back away, to find a different candidate for the pilot program, to preserve his relationship with James Carter while not actually extending the professional opportunity that had been offered. But backing away now would confirm everything James had said about white liberals who made promises in moments of inspiration and then retreated when keeping those promises became uncomfortable. It would prove that Richard's interest in justice and inclusion was performative, existing only so long as it required no sacrifice or risk from him personally. That answers my question, Richard said. I'm going to proceed with the hiring process. It's going to take some time, probably several weeks, because we need to structure this carefully. But I want you to know I'm committed to making this happen. Why? James asked. You don't know me. You have no reason to take this risk. You could hire a dozen other people with clean records and comparable qualifications. Why are you doing this? Richard thought about how to answer, about whether to give the easy response about business benefits and untapped talent, or the honest response about guilt and the desire to do something meaningful after spending decades building wealth without seriously considering its social costs. Because you were right, Richard said finally, about everything you said, about my assumptions, about the systems that waste human potential, about my own intellectual compromises, and because I have power and resources that most people don't have, which means I can take risks that other employers can't or won't take. So I'm taking this one. For selfish reasons, probably, because it makes me feel like I'm using my position for something beyond just accumulating more wealth. But also because you deserve the opportunity, and because the company will benefit from having someone with your intelligence and your perspective. I appreciate the honesty, James said, and I'll tell you honestly that I'm skeptical this works out, but I'm also desperate enough to try. So proceed with your process, and we'll see what happens. The hiring process took 6 weeks, during which time Richard discovered exactly how much institutional resistance existed to hiring someone with James Carter's background. The legal team produced a memo outlining liability scenarios. The board's risk committee asked pointed questions about why Richard was personally invested in this particular hire. Several executives expressed concern about what message it would send to other employees if leadership hired a convicted felon into a senior consulting role. And Richard, for the first time in many years, had to expend political capital on something that provided him no obvious benefit, had to call in favors and make concessions and engage in the kind of organizational maneuvering that he usually reserved for major strategic initiatives. It was exhausting and frustrating, and it gave him a small window into what James Carter must have experienced applying to hundreds of positions and encountering this resistance at every turn, except that Richard had power and credibility and could eventually force the decision through, while James had none of those advantages. The offer letter was sent in mid-December, 3 months after the midnight conversation in the 42nd floor corridor. James Carter was offered the position of Senior Consultant Organizational Development, reporting to the Chief Human Resources Officer at a salary of $135,000 per year, plus benefits and equity participation. The offer letter acknowledged his criminal record, included explicit terms about disclosure to relevant parties, and required a probationary period during which his performance would be evaluated more frequently than standard new hires. It was not a perfect offer, not free from the stigma and surveillance that accompanied being a convicted felon in professional spaces, but it was a real offer, a genuine opportunity to use his education and intelligence in ways that custodial work did not allow. James accepted by email a brief message that thanked Richard for the opportunity and expressed commitment to proving the decision was sound. He started at Meridian Technologies on January 7th, and his presence created exactly the kind of disruption Richard had been warned about. The formal announcement described him as an experienced organizational development professional, joining the team to work on culture and talent initiatives. But the informal networks that existed in every company quickly spread the information that he was a former janitor, that he had a felony conviction, that Richard Ashford had personally championed his hiring over substantial internal objections. Some employees thought it was admirable, a sign that Meridian was serious about second chances and social justice. Others thought it was reckless, a liability waiting to happen. And some, particularly some of the executives who had opposed the hire, treated James with barely concealed hostility, waiting for him to fail so they could validate their original objections. James navigated these dynamics with the same careful competence he had demonstrated in their midnight conversation, aware that he was being scrutinized more closely than other new hires, that any mistake would be magnified, that his presence was a test case for whether the company's stated commitment to inclusion extended to people with criminal records. He dressed impeccably, spoke precisely, produced work that was thorough and insightful, and maintained a professional demeanor that gave critics no easy ammunition. His first major project was an analysis of Meridian's hiring and promotion patterns, examining whether the company's diversity and inclusion initiatives were actually producing meaningful change or whether they were primarily performative. Richard had assigned him the project deliberately, knowing it would surface uncomfortable truths, but believing that honest assessment was necessary for real change. The report James produced after 3 months was devastating. It documented that despite stated commitments to diversity, Meridian's executive team was 87% white and 73% male. It showed that black employees at all levels reported significantly lower satisfaction and higher rates of feeling undervalued compared to white employees. It revealed that promotion rates for people of color lagged substantially behind promotion rates for white employees with comparable performance ratings. And most damningly, It included interview data from employees across the organization describing a culture where diversity was treated as a public relations exercise rather than as a genuine priority, where people of color were hired into junior roles but faced invisible barriers to advancement, where concerns about bias or discrimination were dismissed as oversensitivity. The report landed on Richard's desk on a Tuesday morning in April, and he read it twice, feeling the weight of what James had documented. Every critique was backed by data, every conclusion was carefully reasoned, and the overall picture was of a company that talked about inclusion while practicing exclusion, that celebrated diversity in marketing materials while maintaining overwhelmingly homogeneous leadership. Richard called an executive team meeting for that afternoon, distributed copies of the report, and watched as his leadership team read through James's analysis. The reactions ranged from defensive to dismissive to uncomfortable acknowledgement, and the conversation that followed revealed exactly the dynamics James had described. "This paints us in an unfairly negative light," said Michael Chen, the chief financial officer. "We've made significant investments in diversity recruiting. The fact that we don't have perfect demographic representation in leadership doesn't mean we're discriminating. It means we're drawing from a pipeline that has historical inequities." "The report addresses pipeline arguments," James said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. Page 17. "The data shows that we hire people of color at reasonable rates, but promote them at significantly lower rates than white employees, which suggests the problem is not pipeline, but internal barriers to advancement." "Maybe the performance isn't there," said David Morrison, the chief operating officer, and the comment hung in the air with its implicit assumption that black employees were less competent than white employees. If these dynamics, these conversations about diversity and merit and pipeline that use neutral language to avoid confronting bias, resonate with your experience in corporate environments or elsewhere, consider the importance of ensuring that analyses like James Carter's reach audiences beyond the specific organizations where they are produced. The patterns documented here are not unique to Meridian Technologies, are not isolated incidents, but symptoms of systemic problems requiring collective attention and action. "The performance is there," James replied, his voice level, but his eyes hard. "The report includes performance rating distributions by race. Black employees receive ratings comparable to white employees at the junior and mid-levels, but those ratings translate into promotions less frequently. That's not a performance problem, that's a bias problem." Richard watched his executive team grapple with James's analysis, watched them deploy the familiar rhetorical strategies of deflection and minimization and appeals to complexity. He recognized the pattern because he had participated in similar conversations in the past, had accepted similar rationalizations, had been comfortable with diversity as aspiration rather than diversity as accountability. "We're going to implement the recommendations in this report," Richard said, cutting through the conversation. "All of them. We're going to set specific targets for representation at every level. We're going to mandate training that actually addresses bias rather than just checking compliance boxes. We're going to create accountability mechanisms that make promotion and compensation decisions transparent. And we're going to measure progress quarterly and tie executive compensation to whether we're achieving these goals." The room was silent. Tying executive compensation to diversity metrics was not symbolic, was not performative, was a direct assertion that this was a priority equivalent to financial performance. It would be expensive, would create internal conflict, would likely face pushback from the board. "That seems extreme," David Morrison said. "Diversity is important, but linking comp to it creates perverse incentives. People will game the metrics rather than genuinely changing culture. Then we design metrics that can't be gamed easily. But the point is that we've been treating this as something nice to do if convenient, and the data James has collected shows that approach doesn't work, so we're changing the approach. This is now a core business priority, not a side initiative. The meeting ended with grudging agreement to move forward, though Richard knew that agreement in a meeting was not the same as actual implementation, that his executive team would resist and delay and find reasons why the changes were impractical. The work of transformation was just beginning, and it would require sustained attention and willingness to absorb conflict. But Richard had committed publicly, had staked his credibility on following through, and James Carter's presence on his team meant that someone with both intelligence and personal investment in success would be monitoring whether promises translated into action. Over the following months, Meridian implemented the changes James had recommended, moving from aspiration to actual accountability. The process was messy and contentious, exposing conflicts and resentments that had been beneath the surface. Several executives resisted openly, arguing that merit should be the only criterion for hiring and promotion, and that focusing on diversity was itself a form of discrimination. James handled these objections with a combination of data and directness, repeatedly demonstrating that the status quo was not meritocratic, that existing promotion patterns reflected bias rather than pure performance assessment, that creating accountability around diversity was not lowering standards, but rather ensuring that standards were applied consistently, and slowly, incrementally, things began to change. The proportion of people of color in leadership roles increased. Employee survey data showed improvements in how Black employees experienced the workplace culture. Promotion rates became more equitable. The changes were not revolutionary, were not sufficient to eliminate all disparities, but they represented genuine progress toward the kind of organization Meridian claimed to be. Richard watched James work and was consistently impressed by his competence, his strategic thinking, his ability to navigate complex organizational politics. But he also saw the cost. The way James had to be twice as good as everyone else to be considered adequate, the way his mistakes were scrutinized while similar mistakes by white employees were overlooked, the way he was expected to be grateful for an opportunity that should have been available based on qualifications alone. They had lunch one day in late summer, more than a year after James had joined Meridian, sitting in Richard's office with takeout from a local Thai restaurant. The conversation had been about work, about the diversity initiatives and upcoming projects, but Richard steered it toward more personal territory. "Do you regret accepting this position?" Richard asked. "Has it been worth the scrutiny and the pressure?" James set down his fork and considered the question seriously. "It's been worth it financially. I'm earning more than I ever imagined I would again. I've been able to save money, help my daughter with college expenses, live without the constant anxiety about unexpected expenses. That's not trivial, but it's also been exhausting in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. Every day I'm aware that I'm a test case, that my success or failure will be used to justify future decisions about hiring people with records. That pressure is constant. For what it's worth, you've exceeded every expectation. The work you've done has been transformative for this company. I know, but I also know that transformative work from someone like me is treated as surprising, as exceptional, in ways that comparable work from someone without my background would be treated as simply good performance. The bar is different, and that difference is exhausting." Richard nodded, understanding intellectually, but knowing he could never fully understand experientially what James was describing. "Is there anything I can do to make it more sustainable? Hire more people like me. The burden of being the only one, of being the token success story that the company points to when claiming they believe in second chances, that burden would be lighter if I weren't carrying it alone. Expand the pilot program, make it a permanent practice, not an experiment." It was a reasonable request, and it was also a test of whether Richard's commitment extended beyond the individual case that had triggered his awakening. Hiring James Carter had been difficult, but ultimately manageable, because it was one person, one decision, one risk. Institutionalizing that practice, making it standard rather than exceptional, would require much more sustained effort and much greater organizational change. "I'll talk to Elizabeth and the board," Richard said. "We'll expand the program." But talking to the board meant encountering resistance from people who'd been skeptical of the original pilot and who remained unconvinced that the benefits justified the complications. The board's risk committee had reviewed James's performance and had acknowledged that the hire had worked out, but they questioned whether his success was replicable, whether Meridian should be in the business of social rehabilitation, whether the company's shareholders would support using corporate resources for second-chance employment. Richard found himself making arguments he had never imagined making, talking about moral obligations and wasted human capital and the business case for inclusive hiring practices. He cited research about how people with criminal records who were given meaningful employment opportunities showed lower recidivism rates, about how diverse teams produced better outcomes, about how companies with strong social responsibility reputations attracted better talent. And he talked about James, specifically about the waste of having someone with his intelligence and education cleaning offices because structural barriers made professional employment impossible, about the fact that Meridian was better because they had taken a risk on someone that conventional hiring practices would have excluded. The board ultimately agreed to expand the program, but with conditions and constraints that revealed their continuing discomfort. Hires would be limited to certain roles and levels. Candidates would go through additional screening beyond standard background checks. Performance would be monitored more closely. The program would be reviewed annually to determine whether it should continue. It was a compromise, better than nothing but far from the full commitment to second-chance employment that James had advocated for. But it was progress, the kind of incremental change that sometimes accumulated into transformation if sustained over time. Meridian hired 12 people with criminal records over the following 2 years, placing them in roles ranging from IT to marketing to operations. Some succeeded brilliantly, some performed adequately, and 2 were terminated for cause, the same distribution of outcomes that characterized any group of employees. But the 2 failures were scrutinized intensely, used by skeptics as evidence that the program was misguided, while the successes were minimized as exceptions. James continued working at Meridian, eventually being promoted to Director of Organizational Development, leading a team of 6 people focused on culture change and inclusive practices. He published articles about his experience, speaking openly about being a formerly incarcerated person working in corporate America, and he became a resource for other companies exploring similar programs. And Richard, for his part, found that the experience of hiring James and navigating the subsequent institutional resistance had changed his understanding of how power operated, how apparently neutral systems produced unjust outcomes, how good intentions without structural change accomplished very little. He revised his book, publishing a 3rd edition that restored some of the more radical analysis from his original thesis, and that included a new chapter about his own education through the process of hiring James Carter. The revised book sold less well than the 2nd edition, was criticized by some reviewers as being too political, too focused on social justice rather than business strategy. But it was more honest, more willing to examine uncomfortable truths, and Richard felt less compromised by its existence. 3 years after the midnight conversation on the 42nd floor, Richard and James stood together in a conference room at a business school symposium where they had been invited to speak about organizational change and second-chance employment. They had developed a rhythm in these presentations, Richard speaking about the business case and the process of institutional change, James speaking about the experience of being excluded and the barriers that prevented talented people from contributing. During the Q&A session, a student asked James whether he felt grateful to Richard for giving him an opportunity, and the question hung in the air with its implicit assumptions about charity and benevolence and the proper relationship between powerful white executives and black men with criminal records. James answered carefully, "I'm appreciative that Richard took a risk when most employers wouldn't, but I don't think gratitude is the right frame. I earned this opportunity through my education, my intelligence, my work. What Richard did was remove some of the structural barriers that prevented my qualifications from being recognized. That's important, but it's different from charity. I'm not grateful for charity. I'm appreciative that someone in a position of power chose to challenge a system that was unjust." Richard added, "And I would say that Meridian benefited enormously from hiring James. This wasn't altruism. This was good business. The framing of second-chance employment as charity does a disservice to everyone involved because it obscures the fact that we're talking about accessing talent that's currently wasted because of overly broad exclusion practices." Another student asked whether they thought other companies would follow Meridian's example, whether the program was replicable, whether genuine change was possible. James and Richard exchanged glances, and Richard gestured for James to respond. "Change is possible," James said, "but it requires people in power being willing to be uncomfortable, being willing to challenge their own assumptions, being willing to absorb criticism and resistance. Most companies won't do that unless they're forced to by external pressure or by individuals inside the organization who refuse to accept the status quo. So if you're asking whether change will happen automatically, the answer is no. If you're asking whether change can happen if people work for it, the answer is yes." The symposium ended, and Richard and James walked across the business school campus toward the parking garage. It was late afternoon, the autumn light slanting across the buildings, students moving between classes with the casual confidence of people whose futures felt secure. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked. "Agreeing to take the position, dealing with everything that came with it?" James thought about the question, the same question Richard had asked a year earlier, and his answer had evolved. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I had to be exceptional, to be given an opportunity that should have been available based on basic qualifications. I regret that 3 years later I'm still navigating assumptions and biases that my white colleagues don't face. But I don't regret accepting, because the alternative was continuing to clean offices while knowing I was capable of more. So no, I don't regret it. But I wish the system was different, so that my individual success wasn't remarkable." "I'm working on it," Richard said. "The system part. Not quickly enough, but working on it." "I know. That's why I'm still here." They reached the parking garage, and as they walked to their respective cars, Richard thought about the distance they had traveled from that midnight conversation when he had called James uneducated, and James had quoted his thesis with perfect precision. The memory was humbling, a reminder of how much Richard had not known about the world, despite his Harvard degree and his billions of dollars and his reputation as a business visionary. The real education had happened in the years since, in the process of trying to hire James, and then supporting him, and then working to expand what had started as a single gesture into something more systematic. Richard had learned about background checks and insurance policies and board resistance and executive skepticism. He had learned about implicit bias and structural exclusion and the gap between stated values and actual practices. He'd learned how hard it was to change institutions, even when you nominally controlled them. But he had also learned that change was possible, that individuals could make decisions that cascaded into broader transformations, that power could be used for something beyond just accumulating more power, It was not enough, would never be sufficient to address all the injustices that existed, but it was something. And something was better than nothing, was better than the alternative of remaining comfortable in ignorance. James Carter drove home to the apartment he now rented in a better neighborhood than he had been able to afford on custodial wages, thinking about the symposium and the student questions and the ongoing work of navigating professional spaces as someone whose past was public knowledge. It was exhausting, required constant vigilance, demanded that he be perpetually better than good enough. But it was also meaningful in ways that cleaning offices had not been, allowed him to use his education and intelligence, gave him a platform to advocate for policy changes that might help others facing similar barriers. He was contributing to something larger than his individual situation, building precedents and creating visibility for formerly incarcerated people trying to rebuild their lives. His daughter, Kenya, was graduating from college the following spring, finishing the degree that James's incarceration had made difficult to fund and that his current salary had made possible. She was studying social work, interested in criminal justice reform, shaped by her father's experience into someone who understood intimately how the system failed people and who wanted to work on changing it. James thought about what it would mean to attend her graduation, to watch her walk across the stage in her cap and gown, to know that despite everything he had put their family through with his choices and his incarceration, she had succeeded and was launching into a career focused on justice. It felt like redemption, not complete but real, the possibility of transformation that the carceral system claimed to offer but rarely actually provided. These stories, these accounts of individuals navigating systems designed to exclude them, and sometimes succeeding against substantial odds, matter beyond their immediate participants. If you have followed James Carter's journey from custodial worker to organizational development director, if you recognize the barriers he faced and the assumptions he overcame, consider the value of ensuring that such chronicles reach wider audiences, that they become part of the public conversation about who deserves opportunities and who determines desert. The following year brought additional changes to Meridian Technologies, some directly attributable to James's work and some resulting from broader cultural shifts in corporate America. The company achieved measurable improvements in representation at leadership levels. Employee satisfaction surveys showed meaningful progress in how people of color experience workplace culture. And the Second Chance Employment Program became permanent rather than experimental, with established procedures and protections rather than ad hoc decisions. But the changes also brought backlash. Several executives who had opposed the diversity initiatives left the company, claiming that merit was being sacrificed for political correctness. Some shareholders questioned whether focusing on social issues was distracting from business fundamentals. And conservative media outlets wrote articles criticizing Meridian for hiring felons and for prioritizing diversity over qualification, articles that misrepresented the facts but that shaped public perception nonetheless. Richard found himself defending decisions he had never anticipated having to defend, explaining to investors and board members and journalists that hiring qualified people with criminal records was not lowering standards, but rather expanding the talent pool, that diversity initiatives were about removing bias from evaluation processes rather than about implementing quotas, that companies had social responsibilities beyond maximizing shareholder returns. It was exhausting work, required constant engagement with critics who operated in bad faith, demanded that he repeatedly articulate principles that should have been obvious. But it was also clarifying, forced him to examine his own values and priorities, made him confront questions about what success meant beyond just accumulating wealth. In a quarterly earnings call with analysts, Richard was asked whether Meridian's focus on social responsibility was hurting financial performance, whether shareholders should be concerned that the company was prioritizing progressive politics over profits. Richard's response was direct and unequivocal. Our focus on inclusive hiring practices and organizational equity has improved our financial performance. We're accessing talent that competitors exclude. We're building products and services that reflect a wider range of perspectives and needs. We're attracting employees and customers who value companies that align with their principles. The framing of social responsibility versus profits is false. They're not in tension, they're complementary when done thoughtfully. The answer did not satisfy all analysts, and Meridian's stock price showed some volatility as investors assessed whether Richard's approach represented strategic vision or ideological distraction. But the company's core business remained strong. Revenue continued growing, and over time the market concluded that Meridian's social commitments were not undermining its commercial success. James watched these dynamics unfold from his position inside the organization, simultaneously gratified by the changes Meridian was implementing and aware of their limitations. The company was better than it had been, more equitable in its practices, more honest about its shortcomings. But it was still a for-profit corporation operating in a capitalist system that fundamentally valued wealth accumulation over human well-being. Still an institution where power remained concentrated at the top despite efforts at inclusion. He wrote about these tensions in articles and in the book he was working on during evenings and weekends, a memoir and analysis of his experience moving from incarceration to custodial work to corporate leadership. The book examined what success meant for formerly incarcerated people, what transformations were possible, and what barriers remained intractable. What individual stories could and could not tell us about systemic change. The book was published 2 years later, garnering significant attention and mixed reviews. Some praised it as an important contribution to conversations about criminal justice reform and workplace equity. Others criticized it as being too focused on individual experience rather than systemic analysis, or alternatively, as being too critical of corporate structures, given that James had benefited from corporate employment. The criticisms from both left and right revealed something essential about James's position, the way he occupied a space that was neither fully inside nor fully outside the system, neither completely absorbed by institutional logic nor entirely resistant to it. He was working within corporate structures to change them, accepting the limitations and compromises that came with that choice, maintaining critical distance while also participating in the institutions he critiqued. Richard read the book and found himself portrayed with more complexity than he expected, neither villain nor hero, but rather someone who had made choices shaped by privilege and who was slowly, imperfectly learning to use that privilege toward more just ends. It was not entirely comfortable to see himself depicted so clearly, but it was fair, more fair than he probably deserved. They discussed the book over lunch, their periodic check-ins having evolved into something resembling genuine friendship despite the power differential and the historical circumstances that had brought them together. "You were honest about my limitations," Richard said. "About the ways I approached this from a position of comfort and control. I was. But I was also honest about the fact that you actually followed through, that you took real risks, that you changed when you could have stayed the same. That counts for something, even if it doesn't erase the systemic problems we're operating within. Do you think it matters, the work we've done at Meridian, or is it just rearranging deck chairs while the ship sinks?" James smiled slightly. "That's the question, isn't it? Whether individual institutional changes add up to something meaningful, or whether they're just pressure relief valves that make the system more sustainable without fundamentally transforming it. I don't know the answer. I know that more people with records are getting opportunities at Meridian than would otherwise. I know that the company's culture is more equitable than it was. I know that my life is materially better. But I also know that the broader system of mass incarceration and employment discrimination remains intact, that millions of people are still facing the barriers I faced, that my success is exceptional rather than representative. So, what do we do? Keep working on incremental changes while acknowledging they're insufficient? I think so. Because the alternative is either accepting things as they are, which is morally unacceptable, or waiting for some revolutionary transformation that might never come. Incremental change is frustrating, but it's better than stasis. And sometimes incremental changes accumulate into something more significant. Sometimes. It was an honest assessment, free from either cynicism or naive optimism, grounded in the reality that justice was always partial and always required sustained effort. Richard appreciated the honesty, preferred it to the comfortable platitudes that people in his position usually heard. 5 years after the midnight conversation on the 42nd floor, Meridian Technologies had become known as a leader in second chance employment, with a formal program that had hired more than 50 people with criminal records into professional roles. The program had been studied by academics, profiled in business media, and replicated in modified form by other companies exploring similar approaches. James had been promoted to Vice President of Organizational Development and Social Responsibility, overseeing a team of 20 people working on culture change, inclusive practices, and community partnerships. His compensation had increased substantially. He had accumulated meaningful equity in the company, and he had achieved a level of professional success that seemed impossible from the vantage point of cleaning offices at midnight. But he also knew that his success depended on Richard's willingness to champion him on circumstances that were not replicable for most people in similar situations, on a combination of qualifications and luck and timing that was exceptional rather than typical. For every person like James, who navigated from incarceration to professional success, thousands remained trapped in cycles of poverty and employment, discrimination and social marginalization. The work of addressing those systemic problems continued, extended beyond Meridian into advocacy and policy work that James engaged in during his limited free time. He testified before state legislatures about barriers to employment for formerly incarcerated people. He worked with non-profit organizations, providing job training and placement services. He wrote op-eds and gave interviews and used his platform to highlight the human costs of policies that excluded people with criminal records from meaningful work. And he continued to push Meridian to do more, to expand the Second Chance program, to examine other ways the company's practices might be contributing to inequality, to use its resources and influence toward more just ends. It was exhausting work, never finished, always encountering resistance, but it was work that felt necessary in ways that cleaning offices had not. Richard, for his part, found that his priorities had shifted in ways he had not anticipated. He still cared about Meridian's financial performance, still wanted the company to succeed and grow, but those objectives now existed alongside commitments to equity and social responsibility that he had not previously considered central to his role as CEO. He spent substantial time on initiatives that had no clear ROI, that could not be justified purely in business terms, that represented moral choices about what kind of company Meridian should be. Some of his peers in the business community praised this evolution, saw him as a leader in stakeholder capitalism and corporate social responsibility. Others criticized him as having gone soft, as having been captured by progressive ideology, as prioritizing politics over shareholders. Richard found that he cared less than he once would have about such criticisms, that his sense of identity was less tied to peer approval than it had been earlier in his career. In a speech at a business school commencement, Richard talked about the midnight conversation with James Carter, about the assumptions he had made and the education he had received in the years since. He talked about how success in business was not just about innovation and strategy, but about using power responsibly, about building organizations that created value in multiple dimensions, about measuring success not just in shareholder returns, but in human flourishing. The speech was well received by the graduating students, less well received by some alumni and donors who preferred commencement addresses that celebrated entrepreneurship and wealth creation without complicated discussions of equity and justice. But Richard had learned that speaking uncomfortable truths was part of using privilege toward better ends, that leadership sometimes required making people uncomfortable, that transformation demanded challenging the narratives that made existing power structures seem natural and inevitable. After the speech, several students approached him with questions about how to navigate careers in business while maintaining commitments to social justice, how to work within systems while trying to change them, how to avoid being absorbed by institutional logics that prioritize profit over people. Richard's answers were honest about the difficulties, about the compromises and contradictions, about the reality that there were no pure positions, no choices free from complicity. "The best advice I can give you," Richard said to one student who was particularly earnest in her questioning, "is to find someone like James Carter, not to save them or to be their benefactor, but to learn from them. To have your assumptions challenged by people whose experiences are different from yours. To build relationships across difference that actually change how you understand the world. And then to use whatever privilege and power you accumulate in service of making systems more just, knowing that you'll never do it perfectly, but doing it anyway." It was incomplete advice, acknowledged the limits of individual action while still affirming its importance, and the student nodded thoughtfully as if recognizing the complexity without being paralyzed by it. Years would pass, bringing additional changes to Meridian and to Richard and James individually. The company would face new challenges and opportunities, would continue evolving its practices around equity and inclusion, would sometimes succeed and sometimes fall short in living up to its stated values. Richard would eventually step back from day-to-day operations, transitioning to executive chairman and bringing in new leadership while maintaining influence over strategic direction. James would continue his work, would potentially move to other organizations or into full-time advocacy, would keep pushing for changes while navigating the exhaustion and compromise that came with that work. But the core reality that had been revealed in that midnight conversation remained central to both men's understanding of the world, that intelligence and capability were distributed far more widely than credentials and opportunity, that vast amounts of human potential were wasted by systems that used apparently neutral criteria to maintain exclusion, that changing those systems required people with power making choices that were uncomfortable and costly, and that such changes, while necessary, were always insufficient without broader transformation. The story that began with Richard calling James uneducated and then freezing when James quoted his Harvard thesis was not primarily a story about individual redemption or about one generous executive giving someone a chance. It was a story about how assumptions shaped by race and class and professional hierarchy prevented people from seeing what was in front of them, about how systemic barriers operated through the cumulative effect of individual decisions, about how change required both individual courage and collective action. And it was a story that needed telling, needed sharing, needed circulation beyond the specific context of Meridian Technologies and Boston and these particular individuals. Because the patterns it illuminated were not unique, were not isolated, but were repeated across thousands of organizations and millions of interactions where people with knowledge and capability were dismissed because they lacked the right credentials or occupied the wrong social positions. If you have read this far, if you have engaged with this chronicle and understood its implications, then you have a responsibility that extends beyond passive consumption. The responsibility is to recognize these patterns when you encounter them, to challenge the assumptions that sustain them, to use whatever power or influence or resources you possess toward creating more equitable conditions, and to ensure that stories like James Carter's reach audiences beyond those already convinced of their importance. The work is never finished. The systems that create barriers to opportunity and that waste human potential continue operating, continue producing outcomes that are unjust and inefficient and corrosive to collective well-being. But the work is also not futile. Changes happen incrementally and imperfectly, but really. People like James Carter get opportunities they were previously denied. Organizations like Meridian Technologies become slightly more equitable. Conversations like the one that happened at midnight on a 42nd floor corridor sometimes catalyze transformations that extend far beyond their immediate participants. Whether those changes accumulate into something approaching justice, whether individual stories aggregate into systemic transformation, whether the arc of history bends toward equity or merely circles without progress, these questions remain open, remain dependent on choices that people make every day about whether to challenge or to accommodate, whether to speak or to stay silent, whether to use power toward inclusive or exclusive ends. James Carter and Richard Ashford made their choices, imperfectly and with mixed results, but genuinely. Others will make their own choices, in their own contexts, facing their own versions of the moment when assumptions collide with reality, and when the comfortable option is to look away, while the difficult option is to engage. The hope is that enough people, in enough moments, choose engagement over avoidance, choose justice over comfort, and that those choices accumulate over time into something that resembles the more equitable world that remains possible, even if not yet actual. That is the story, that is the lesson, that is the challenge extended to anyone who encounters this account and who has the power, however modest, to influence the systems within which they operate. What you do with that challenge determines whether stories like this one remain exceptional or become obsolete, because the conditions they describe no longer exist. The choice is yours. The work continues. The necessity remains constant.